There are moments in history when the fate of nations changes not through the thunder of cannons or the roar of engines on a battlefield, but through a quiet shift in authority, a change in leadership that alters the course of war and the destiny of the men who fight it. The story of what General George S. Patton said when General Dwight D. Eisenhower took command over him is one of the most emotionally complex and deeply human moments of World War II. It is not simply a military event, not merely a line in a textbook, but a powerful story of pride, loyalty, heartbreak, and courage inside the soul of a man who lived for victory. It was late 1943, the world drowning in war, when the Allied High Command made a decision that would reshape everything. Dwight D. Eisenhower would be appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. It was a role that carried unimaginable responsibility, the planning and execution of the invasion of Europe itself, the greatest military operation in human history. Newspapers would celebrate Eisenhower as a calm, strategic, diplomatic leader who could unite the British and American forces, a man who could handle political pressure and international expectations. But for Patton, the news struck like a silent explosion. It was not that he disliked Eisenhower. In fact, they had known each other for decades. They were classmates at West Point. They had trained together, joked together, dreamed together. In another world, they might have grown old telling stories over bourbon. But this was war, and in war, friendship becomes complicated, and ambition becomes a battlefield no less brutal than any fought with steel. Patton had been forged for command. He had proven himself in North Africa, where American forces were shaken and uncertain until he arrived like a storm and turned chaos into discipline. Soldiers who once stumbled now marched with pride. Tanks that once sat frozen now charged forward. Defeat transformed into momentum. When Patton's boots hit the sand, the entire attitude of the American army shifted, and the world took notice. And in Sicily, he did the impossible, driving his men faster than any expected, beating the legendary British commander Bernard Montgomery to Messina, shocking the world with a daring victory that electrified the press and terrified the Axis command. Everywhere Patton went, he created headlines, hope, and fear. He was seen as the warrior America had been waiting for, a man whose voice could make soldiers believe they were unstoppable. And yet now, despite all of that, despite the victories and medals and cheers, he was no longer the man chosen to lead the greatest campaign of the war. Someone else was stepping into the role that Patton had dreamed of since he was a young cadet, who believed destiny had written leadership into his blood. The room where the announcement was made was silent, thick with tension and unspoken emotion. Many officers shifted awkwardly in their seats, unsure whether to celebrate or brace for an explosion. Everyone knew Patton's reputation: passionate, outspoken, fearless, intense. His voice could fill a field. His beliefs could move mountains. If anyone would react with fury, it would be George S. Patton. But what happened next stunned everyone present. When Eisenhower's appointment was formally pronounced, Patton stood tall, his face carved in stone, his jaw tight as iron beneath his skin. He did not move for a moment, and the silence stretched painfully long, like the pause before thunder. And then, slowly, he stepped forward. His boots struck the floor with sharp, echoing precision, each step like the beat of a war drum. Eisenhower's eyes lifted to him, perhaps expecting an argument, perhaps bracing for an outburst. But instead, Patton did something no one expected: not anger, not protest, but something far more powerful. With a controlled breath, forcing pride deep beneath discipline, Patton said, "Congratulations, Ike. The country needs you, and the army will follow you." The room froze in absolute stillness. Officers, who had been holding their breath, exhaled at once. It was respect, it was loyalty, it was duty. But beneath the surface, those words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. After a moment that seemed to stretch through history itself, Patton continued, his voice quieter but firm, like a distant drumbeat, still sounding through smoke. "Just remember, my men and I are ready whenever you call on us. Point us toward the enemy, and we'll do the job. It sounded like support. It sounded like unity. But behind the mask, inside the tightly locked vault of his heart, Patton was bleeding, because every syllable cost him more than any bullet ever had. As Eisenhower nodded, accepting the role now bestowed upon him by history, Patton's eyes remained fixed on him, not with hatred, but with the agony of watching someone else receive the fate he once believed was his. There are wounds no doctor can treat, and this was one of them. When the meeting ended, and men stood to salute and shake hands, and speak in rehearsed tones about honor and unity, Patton walked out alone. The corridors outside echoed with the hollow ring of his footsteps, each step heavy with thoughts he could not speak. His medals shone under the dim lights, but to him, they suddenly felt like empty metal. In the quiet of that hallway, when no one was near, and no reporters or generals could witness the truth, Patton whispered words only the walls heard. I was born to command armies, and now I must learn to command myself. In that moment, a different kind of war began, not against enemy nations, not against German tanks or Axis strategies, but against himself, against ego, against pain, against the unbearable weight of knowing someone else now held the authority he believed destiny created for him. Pride is a powerful weapon, and an even more powerful burden. Yet Patton was a soldier not just by rank, but by soul. He believed in service, in sacrifice, in the idea that a man must give everything to something greater than himself. And so he forced himself to stand unbroken. He reminded himself that the war was not about his ambition or Eisenhower's promotion. It was about young soldiers who needed leadership, mothers praying for sons to return alive, a world drowning in darkness that needed light. The hardest victories, he reminded himself, are not won on battlefields, but inside the human spirit. But something else lived inside Patton too. Fire, a flame that refused to dim, even when buried beneath silence and discipline. He did not say it out loud, not in that hallway, not to Ike, not to anyone, but deep inside. He vowed that he would prove his worth again, that history had not written its last chapter about him. He refused to believe that his destiny had been taken away. He believed it had only been delayed. And as he stepped outside into the cold air that cut across his face like steel, Patton lifted his eyes to the sky, and the determination that had once moved armies returned to his chest. He whispered under his breath, not bitterly, not angrily, but with the solemn power of a man who refuses to surrender his place in the world. The war is not over. My time will come. His driver watched him from a few feet away. Noticing the tears, Patton blinked back quickly so no one would see. He saluted silently and opened the car door. Patton paused, one hand on the frame of the vehicle, looking back at the building he had just left. It had taken every piece of strength he possessed not to break in front of those men. And now alone, he felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying not to fall. But he did not fall. He inhaled once, straightened his shoulders, and climbed aboard, ready to continue serving the country he loved more than his own pride. That day marked the beginning of the most painful chapter of Patton's military life. Newspapers soon carried headlines celebrating Eisenhower. Radio broadcasts praised Ike's leadership, his calm diplomacy, his ability to unite allied leaders who often clashed. The world celebrated him as the hero who would lead the liberation of Europe. And everywhere Patton went, he heard it. Men greeted him politely but carefully. Some avoided his eyes, uncertain what to say. Others whispered, guessing what he might be feeling. But no one truly understood, because unless you have lived your whole life believing that you were born to lead, no one can understand what it feels like to watch someone else take your place. Night after night, Patton lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts that felt like ghosts. He did not hate Eisenhower. He respected him, admired his calm leadership, understood why he was chosen. But admiration does not erase pain. Respect does not silence longing. Duty does not extinguish destiny. Yet in those long nights, something profound happened inside him. Instead of destroying him, the pain sharpened him. Instead of breaking, he hardened. Instead of surrendering, he made a decision that would change everything. He would not allow his pride to define him. He would rise higher than his disappointment. He would fight harder than his heartbreak. he would prove, not only to the world, but to himself, that he was still the man who could move mountains. In silence, without witnesses, he whispered into the darkness, "Let them choose their commander. I will show them their warrior." And history would soon reveal how true those words would become. Because destiny was not finished with George S. Patton, and neither was war. Patton's car rolled through the dark roads that night, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the cold European fog. He sat silently in the back seat, his gloved hands resting rigidly on his knees, staring out into the black horizon, where the sound of distant artillery faintly echoed across the night air. Those explosions were not near enough to shake the ground beneath the tires, but they trembled inside his chest. They reminded him of who he was, of the battlefield calling to him like an unfinished sentence. Yet now he was being asked to wait, to obey, to stand behind another man's command, and the weight of it pressed against him like a stone on his lungs. He had fought countless enemies, but none had ever been more suffocating than silence. In the lonely hum of the engine, he replayed the moment of the announcement again and again. Each time, he felt the sting of humiliation all over again. He remembered the faces in that room, the polite nods, the visible relief when he chose not to erupt in fury. He wondered what they thought of him now. Did they see a loyal soldier or a defeated man? Did they believe he had accepted that his destiny now belonged to someone else? The thought twisted like a blade. For Patton, being second was not a position, it was a prison, and yet he knew he could not show the world that the bars were closing in around him. His driver, a young man named Sergeant Meeks, glanced into the mirror once, hesitation flickering across his face as if debating whether to speak. Patton noticed, turning his head slightly, his voice sharp but not unkind as he asked, "What is it, Sergeant?" Meeks swallowed, hands tight on the wheel, and said softly, "Sir, the men still believe in you. They talk about you every day. They'd follow you anywhere. Just thought you should know that." Patton did not respond immediately. His throat tightened, and for a moment he could not trust his voice. He stared out the window again, the darkness reflecting faintly in his eyes. Finally, he murmured, barely above a whisper, "Thank you." It was the first genuine warmth he had allowed himself to feel since the decision was made, and yet it hurt, because loyalty reminded him not of what he had, but of what he feared he might be losing. The next morning, Patton walked among his soldiers, moving from tent to tent, shaking hands, listening to their concerns, offering words of courage. He forced a smile when needed, though inside, he felt hollow. Men straightened when they saw him, their eyes filled with admiration, their faces lighting with energy, as if electricity surged through the air. To them, he was still the great warrior, the unstoppable force who refused to let fear touch them. They did not see the cracks beneath his armor. They did not hear the echoes of doubt inside him. And so Patton stood taller, spoke louder, forced his voice to carry the confidence he did not feel. A general is more than a strategist, he is a symbol, and he would not allow that symbol to break. But when night returned, and the campfires burned low, and the soldiers slept, Patton sat alone in his quarters, staring at a map of Europe spread across the table before him. His fingers traced the shoreline of France, the location he knew would become the center of the war, the place where lives would be decided and history would be written in fire. He knew that Eisenhower now sat at the heart of that planning. He knew that Ike was meeting with commanders, inspecting troops, shaping the future. And he, George Patton, the man known for lightning war, for sweeping victories, for fearless leadership, he was on the sidelines, waiting like a spectator rather than a soldier. It was agony. He had been taught that the greatest enemy a man could face was fear. But he now understood something deeper. Sometimes the greatest enemy is helplessness. He whispered into the stillness, "Give me a battlefield, God. Any battlefield. Just don't let me rot in silence." His voice cracked softly, and he pressed both hands against the table, eyes burning. He had fought entire armies with less pain than he felt at that moment. Days passed, heavy and slow, one dragging like metal across stone. The newspapers continued to praise Eisenhower, calling him the leader who would bring victory. And though Patton respected the man, every headline felt like a reminder that history believed Eisenhower was the one the world needed, not him. But destiny is never settled in newspapers. It is shaped in moments of crisis. And soon, crisis arrived. The winter of 1944 was one of the harshest Europe had ever seen. Snow buried roads, froze engines, swallowed soldiers in endless white. The Germans, believing the Allies overconfident and unprepared, launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It struck like lightning, shattering Allied lines, crushing morale, pushing American forces into retreat. The news hit headquarters like an earthquake. Commanders panicked. Supplies ran short. Communications broke. Thousands of young soldiers stood freezing in the snow, surrounded, overwhelmed, unsure if they would live to see another dawn. And at the heart of that crisis was the 101st Airborne Division, trapped at Bastogne, surrounded, without hope of escape. Eisenhower stared at the maps, anxiety tightening his features. Every plan he reviewed collapsed under the brutal reality of the situation. They needed reinforcements fast, but none were positioned close enough to reach Bastogne before the Germans destroyed it entirely. Desperation crept into the room like smoke, choking the air. The fate of the entire war hung on that moment. And then, someone spoke the name they all feared and needed. Patton. Eisenhower's eyes lifted. For a long moment he remained silent, the weight of decision heavy upon him. Then he nodded and issued the order to call General George S. Patton. Far away, Patton stood with his staff when the messenger arrived, the urgent note trembling slightly in the young soldier's hands. Patton opened it, scanning the lines quickly, and for the first time since that wrenching day when Eisenhower took command over him, fire surged through his chest again. His eyes flashed with purpose, lightning striking across his soul. He looked up at his officers, voice ringing through the room like a bell awakened from deep sleep. "Gentlemen, we are turning north. We are going to Bastogne." His officers stared in disbelief. Turning an entire army 90 degrees on short notice was considered impossible, suicidal even. The roads were frozen, the weather brutal, the logistics unimaginable. But Patton felt alive again, as if the war itself had reached out and put a sword back into his hand. He stepped closer to the map, stabbing a finger onto the spot where the 101st was surrounded. And with a voice filled with steel and fire, he said, "No American army is going to surrender while I still live and breathe." It was not bravado, it was a vow. The room erupted into motion. Orders flew, engines roared, soldiers grabbed weapons and supplies with renewed determination. Hope returned like a spark catching dry grass. That night, as his army began the impossible march north, Patton stood outside beneath the falling snow, breath freezing in the air, watching the endless line of tanks and trucks and men moving forward through the darkness. And in that moment, he allowed himself to feel something he had not felt since the day Eisenhower was placed above him. Purpose. He whispered to the wind, "This is who I am." He did not know if they would succeed. He did not know if they would reach the 101st in time. He did not know if history would celebrate him or bury him. But he knew he would rather die fighting than live waiting. Hours later, Eisenhower received word that Patton had already begun the daring movement. The officers around Ike stared in astonishment, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Eisenhower himself felt a surge of admiration, mixed with the familiar tension of two men bound by fate. He knew Patton could turn defeat into victory if anyone could. And quietly, he spoke words that would never leave that room. "Patton succeeds. He will save this war." But Patton did not hear those words. He did not need praise or recognition or awards. He only needed the chance to do what he was born to do: lead men into battle, turn chaos into direction, transform despair into triumph. And as his vehicles rumbled across the frozen ground, he closed his eyes for a moment, speaking to himself, to fate, to God. "Eisenhower may lead the army," he murmured, "but I will lead the fight." He felt no anger now, only strength, only clarity, only destiny. And destiny was calling louder than ever. The engines roared through the frozen night as Patton's Third Army advanced relentlessly toward Bastogne, pushing against snowdrifts as tall as men, winds so sharp they cut through uniforms, in temperatures so low that steel froze to fingertips. Yet nothing slowed them. Soldiers who had barely slept in days pushed forward with the determination, fueled not by orders, but by belief in the man who led them. They had seen Patton turn hopeless battles into victories, and they knew if there was anyone on earth who could break through the German lines and rescue the 101st Airborne, it was George S. Patton. Every rumbling tank track seemed to beat like a drum, echoing through the icy air. Bastogne, Bastogne, Bastogne. The world said it could not be done. That to reroute an entire army in the middle of winter, faster than any commander had ever moved troops before, was beyond human capability. But Patton never believed in the word impossible. He believed in will. He believed in destiny. He believed in the power of men who refused to surrender, in when surrounded by death on all sides. As the army pushed forward, Patton rode in the lead column, refusing to sit comfortably inside the armored warmth of a protected vehicle. He wanted the men to see him, to know he was with them, to understand that he would never ask anything. He was unwilling to endure himself. Frost clung to his coat, snow plastered against his helmet. Wind whipped at his face until his skin burned red. But he stared forward, unblinking, gripping the edges of the Jeep, with hands that trembled only with fury toward the enemy, who dared try to crush American spirit. He turned to his driver, speaking through the roar of engines and storm. "There are men dying in the snow ahead of us. Meeks, every second counts. We move faster." The hours felt like years. Every mile was a battle. German artillery fired blindly into the storm, shells erupting around them, sending shards of ice and earth into the air. Vehicles slid off icy roads. Engines broke down from the cold. Medics struggled to keep wounded men from freezing before they could even be carried away. But no one stopped. Not one soldier turned back. They pushed forward with a desperation that transformed into something far greater hope. And Patton's eyes burned with intensity, knowing that this was the moment he had been waiting for since the day Eisenhower was placed above him. It was the moment he could prove that command was not given by rank, but earned by courage. He had not spoken to Eisenhower since receiving the order, and he did not need to. His actions would speak louder than any words ever could. But deep inside, beneath the iron of his spirit, Patton felt the weight of what this mission truly represented. Not just the rescue of the 101st, not just the turning of the war, but the vindication of his soul. As dawn broke, the sky glowed faintly pink against the frozen horizon, revealing smoke rising in the distanced outskirts of Bastogne. The sound of gunfire intensified, rapid bursts, echoing like frantic heartbeats. Patton's jaw tightened, and he stood up slightly in the moving jeep despite the danger, shouting above the wind, "We're close, boys. Bastogne is just ahead." Soldiers around him cheered, voices cracking with exhaustion and relief. It was as if the entire army inhaled at once, lungs filling with fire. They could feel victory within reach. Then came the moment when Patton saw the first battered perimeter of the besieged American forces. Smoke poured from broken vehicles. Trees splintered by artillery lay scattered like broken bones. Wounded men struggled through knee-deep snow, faces pale, eyes hollow. For days they had fought without proper supplies, without winter clothing, without rest, surrounded on all sides by enemy forces. But when they saw Patton's tanks break through the tree line, something unbelievable happened. Men who could barely stand threw their helmets into the air. Soldiers too weak to lift rifles screamed his name. They shouted, cried, laughed all at once, like prisoners tasting freedom. One young paratrooper, face covered in frostbite, limped forward and grabbed the side of Patton's jeep with shaking hands, his voice breaking as he cried out, "Thank God, sir. We thought no one was coming." Patton leaned down and gripped the soldier's arm, holding it tightly, his voice steady but rough with emotion. "Son, always come for you. No American soldier is ever abandoned." The soldier wept uncontrollably, burying his face in his sleeve, and Patton's eyes glistened with weakness, but with the overwhelming weight of knowing what this moment meant. This was why he existed. This was why he endured humiliation. This was why he fought. As fighting raged around them, Patton stood tall amid the smoke and gunfire, giving rapid orders with the precision that carved chaos into strategy. Artillery repositioned, armor advanced, infantry surged forward, and within hours, the Germans, who had nearly crushed the Allied lines, found themselves stunned and forced back. Bastogne was saved. The turning point of the war had arrived, and news spread like wildfire across Europe, across the world. Across every battlefield where soldiers prayed for victory, reporters rushed to headquarters, telegrams flew, radios crackled with electrifying broadcasts. Eisenhower received the message first. Relief of Bastogne achieved. Patton has broken through. Ike stared at the words for a long moment, letting silence settle around him. The officers nearby watched him closely, and then something remarkable happened. Eisenhower smiled, not a small, polite smile, but a deep one, filled with pride and gratitude. He looked around at the men gathered before him and spoke words that would forever echo through history. Let the word go out. General Patton has saved the American army. He said it not as a rival, not as a superior, not as a man who once outranked him in ambition, but as a leader recognizing another leader. And those in the room felt the power of that moment, understanding that history was being written not in competition, but in unity. Later that day, Eisenhower called Patton directly. When Patton lifted the receiver, the line was quiet for a second, heavy with all the words unspoken between them. Then Eisenhower's voice came softly but clearly. George, you did it. The world owes you a debt. Patton closed his eyes, gripping the phone tightly, listening to a silence that was no longer painful, but full of meaning. He breathed slowly, then answered with words shaped not by pride, but by sincerity. Ike, I was only doing my duty. Eisenhower responded gently. No, George, you were doing what only you could do. And for the first time since the day Eisenhower had taken command over him, Patton felt peace. Not the peace of quiet, but the peace of fulfillment. When Patton walked through the camp later that evening, soldiers erupted into cheers, applauding not as followers, but as men saluting the warrior who had refused to give up on them. They crowded around him, shaking his hand, clapping his shoulders, shouting his name through the icy air. But Patton did not revel in the celebration. His eyes moved across the field, seeing the wounded carried away on stretchers, seeing crosses already rising from the snow, seeing the heavy price of victory. He did not smile. Instead, he removed his helmet and bowed his head in silence. Tears slipped down his face, mixing with the falling snow, because for him, victory was not measured in medals or praise or headlines. It was measured in lives saved and lives lost. Later, alone in his tent, Patton sat at his desk and wrote in his journal, hand trembling slightly as he formed each word. He wrote about the men who held the line at Bastogne, about the courage that refused to break even when surrounded, about the ice and blood and unshakable spirit that defined the American soldier. And then he wrote something personal, something meant for no one else. I am grateful for what has happened, for the chance to serve, and perhaps the humiliation was necessary. A man cannot lead others until he has conquered himself. He paused, staring at the final line he wrote that night. Eisenhower took command over me, but God gave me command over destiny. The war continued, battles raged, history marched on, but the rescue of Bastogne became one of the most defining moments of World War II. It was the point at which the Allies proved they would not break. It was the moment Germany realized the war was slipping away. It was the moment when George S. Patton burned his name permanently into the foundation of American legend. And though Eisenhower remained the supreme commander, and though newspapers continued to place his name in the largest print, something else changed, something deeper than rank or fame. Eisenhower and Patton stood together afterward, not as commander and subordinate, but as two men who understood that leadership is not about authority, but about purpose. They looked one another in the eye, decades of friendship and rivalry flowing between them like unspoken language. Eisenhower extended his hand and said quietly, George, I could not have won this war without you. Patton took his hand firmly, his voice locked with emotion as he answered, "And I would have followed you through hell to do it." In that moment, two destinies were no longer in conflict, they were united. When history is written, many people see only the surface, the medals, the speeches, the ranks. But behind every title is a story of struggle, doubt, sacrifice, and unbreakable will. Patton's greatest victory was not winning the race to Messina, not smashing through German armies in North Africa, not even saving Bastogne. His greatest victory was mastering himself. Because only when a man conquers his own pride does he become unstoppable. Years later, when soldiers spoke of him, they did not speak only of speed or ferocity or battlefield genius. They spoke of loyalty, of courage, of a man who refused to leave his own in the snow. They said, if Patton was coming, we knew we would live. And that was the legacy he carried, greater than titles, greater than promotions, greater than command. History remembers the day Eisenhower took command over Patton, but history celebrates the day Patton saved the world when it needed him most. And when asked what he truly felt about the man who once stood above him, Patton's answer, spoken privately near the end of his life, revealed the truth behind everything he had endured. Ike was the right man to lead the army, but I was the right man to win the battle. And together, we brought victory. And that is what Patton said, through words, through action, through destiny itself.